I wanted to talk about a phrase. There's a really common phrase that as Americans we are used to hearing, and it says, where somebody's off the reservation. And what that means is it's a reference to somebody who's going rogue in some way, somebody who's going outside some kind of bounds of normalcy or doing something that they shouldn't be doing. That's kind of like a renegade kind of act. And I want to talk about the history of that and what where that comes from. And what it is, it's a reference to a part of American history that goes back to the early reservation days when the United States was aggressively pursuing treaties with tribes in order to extract land cessions from 375 or so that were that were ratified and now are extant, thus currently existing treaty arrangements that they last in perpetuity. So those early reservation days was a time when the federal government was actively pursuing this policy of containing Indians to these bounded spaces that we call reservations. Reservations are tracts of land that tribes reserved for themselves in these treaty negotiations after they had ceded land to the United States. So they are not gifts of the United States to tribes. It's the opposite. Tribes gave land to the United States and then reserved some for themselves, thus the term reservation. So in those early days, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, those reservations were more like prison camps or concentration camps because typically Native people weren't allowed to leave without permission from the Indian agent. And that means that they weren't able to go out and hunt and fish and gather food in their traditional and accustomed places that were beyond those reservation boundaries. So when they did, they were off the reservation. They were going off the reservation without permission. And so that's where this phrase comes from. It's a phrase that I hear said a lot, even in like progressive spaces or by progressive people. I hear it, it comes up occasionally in media. Like I was listening to some of the people that I listen to are like for news and analysis about our current political realities. I listen a lot to Don Lemon and Jim Acosta and the Midas Touch Network. I listen to iHip News, which is the I've Had It podcast by these two white women from Oklahoma, Jen and Angie, and I really like the content. And there's numerous others that I analysis that I listen to. A lot of them are ex-Republicans, ex-Republican politicos and strategists, like the Lincoln Project, Rick Wilson, and a lot of lawyers. I listen to a lot of legal analysis. And again, a lot of them are former Republicans or people who identify as conservative, but do not support the Republican Party in its current form. So the other day I heard on the iHip podcast with Jen and Angie, and Jen used this phrase about somebody being off the reservation. And I'm like, it rubs me the wrong way to hear that because it's very thoughtless. It's really not understanding where that phrase comes from and how for Native people it's very hurtful. It brings up memories of bad times, a lot of trauma, and this history of profound injustice. So I want to I want to tie this into a couple of different things. And especially right now, it's about these ICE raids and what's happening with this lawless Trump administration. Really, it's a regime at this point. It's an authoritarian, uh, creeping fascistic regime. That's what we're seeing in this country. That's why these ICE raids are so troubling, that they can, go around masked without identification, just pull people from their cars, pull people from their houses without judicial warrants, outside the bounds of the Constitution, completely outside due process. And it's, we've seen two people be killed, Alex Preddy and Renee Good. And a lot of people have been hurt. They have, there have been, at least, depending on what count you listen to, at least 170 people or more that were American citizens that were wrongfully detained. And it's this wanton wholesale detention of anybody they can just take and abduct with impunity, without accountability whatsoever. And it's happened to Native people. There have been numerous instances of Native people being taken and abducted as well. And I remember when I first heard about it, there was that first incident that I heard about was sometime last year in 2025, and they had raided a fire line. So up in Washington State, there was some people working, like fighting a wildfire, and they detained two Umatilla enrolled members of the Umatilla Nation, and they were just fighting fires. But because of the way they looked, they got racially profiled and they got detained for some period of time while they're fighting a fire. Like, that's insane. And then there was another incident of a woman who was a member of the Salt River Pima tribe, but she got detained in the state of Iowa. But she was an American citizen and an enrolled member of a tribe, and so she still gets detained. Then there were numerous instances in Arizona of Navajo people getting detained. Why? Again, because they were racially profiled, and these ICE agents can't tell the difference between a Navajo and a Mexican. Any person who spent any time in Indian country, which none of these guys know, they don't know what the fuck they're doing. So a bunch of Navajo people got detained. And then there was Elaine Miles. Elaine Miles, of course, is a well-known Native actress. She's another enrolled Umatilla citizen. She got detained, taken from her car, I think is what it was, again in Washington State. And I watched her social media as she documented this thing for days, and it was just outrageous that she would be taken. She presented her tribal ID, and the ICE agent said, no, that looks fake. They didn't accept it. And these are goons, right? They're goons that have little to no training. They're thugs that are, living out their wet dreams of bullying people and hurting people with impunity. So that's who these guys are. That's what's happening. A lot of these guys are the pardoned Jan 6ers that, are out there doing Trump's bidding and exacting revenge on his behalf and on their own behalf. Okay, so we can, we understand that. And then there was a couple, was it last week? I think it was last week or the week before, in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, there were 4 Native people who were detained, who were 3 of whom were enrolled tribal members, and one of them was a descendant of Red Lake. And so those guys got detained, and to add insult to injury, they were sent to Fort Snelling. That's where the Bishop Whipple Federal Building is, and that's where these ICE victims are being detained. Well, Fort Snelling is the site of literally an old fort that one of the worst atrocities in American history toward American Indians happened, and that was the mass hanging of the Dakota 28. and that happened on the order of President Abraham Lincoln, and that was, I'm thinking, 1864, right around there, and it was the biggest mass execution of any people in American history. And so that's where these guys, these native people, got taken to Fort Snelling. Now, I want to bring in another piece, and I'm going to refer to a very well-known phrase also that came from the respected legal scholar Felix Cohen, who wrote this, like, canonical legal text called the Handbook of Federal Indian Law, and that was written in the 1940s. And Felix Cohen wrote famously, Native Americans are the canary in the coal mine in the U.S., and meaning that what happens to Native people will eventually happen to other people. And I think that's what we're seeing in this country with this rogue, fascistic Trump regime detaining. It's not even about, it doesn't even seem to be about the mass deportations anymore. It's really about intimidation, scaring people into submission, so that they do not resist this basically Project 2025 agenda that they have made very clear that they want to install, this theocratic white nationalist program in the U.S. That's what this is all about, in my opinion. So, also, I had written, me personally, in my second book, As Long as Grass Grows, I had written in there, in the front matter of the book, I had said that we are all on the reservation now, and I want to put that into context too, and talk about what I meant by that, because I think we're really seeing it ramp up. And in that book, of course, I'm looking at the concept of environmental justice for Native people, and I looked at the Standing Rock Sioux, the No Dakota Access Pipeline conflict on the Standing Rock Reservation, and that was a case study for that book. And to review what that conflict was about, was the rerouting of an oil pipeline away from the city of Bismarck, North Dakota, which is a 90% white city, who rejected this pipeline coming near their city because of the risks to their drinking water supply. So they reroute this pipeline to away from the city, but down to within a half a mile of the border of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. And that made it an environmental justice issue, because it targeted Native people in this way that put them at risk for harm for this industrial process. That, let's be clear, that everybody knows that these oil pipelines leak, and in this particular segment of the pipeline, it was scheduled to be routed underneath this lake called Lake Oahe, which was the sole drinking source, is the sole drinking source for the Standing Rock Sioux people, but not only them, but 17 million people downstream from them. So that conflict was never only about protecting tribal citizens. It was about protecting everybody in the region who rely on that water. So in that conflict, the federal government pushed this pipeline project through with these rushed permits, and ultimately without adequately consulting with the tribes in a way that was required by law, to the extent that finally, after months and months of that, of protesting there, finally the Obama administration had put a stop to it. They halted the project. It was at the 11th hour, and in the meantime, Trump had gotten elected in November of 2016. Obama stops the project in December of that same year. But we all knew what was going to happen because Trump had made it clear once he got in office he was going to greenlight the project, and there would be no legal process that would be satisfactory for the tribe and for all those people downstream. So that's how it played out. The pipeline got built, and it's become this story of massive environmental injustice for the tribe and 17 million other people downstream. So when I wrote that we're all on the reservation now, it was a reference to that, like just connecting that Indigenous concerns about the environment are not just Indigenous concerns, they are concerns for everybody, because we are all neighbors now. We are all subject to these abusive practices of, in the case of the Trump administration, what they did in that first term was they rolled back all these environmental protections, just like they're doing now. And so it exposes everybody to all this environmental risk and harm in these horrible ways. So that's with regard to environmental kinds of problems. But now I'm saying, like, we are all on the reservation in this much more extended way. And the killing of Renegade and Alex Preddy, white American citizens who were out there defending against these illegal ICE raids, trying to protect their neighbors. They were just out there protesting, using their First Amendment rights, and they were both executed for that. And this is a clear indication about how nobody is safe anymore. If white American citizens can be executed, killed, if they can be pulled out of their cars, if they can be detained by ICE without warrants, without explanation, then no one is safe anymore. So again, yeah, we are all on the reservation now from an Indigenous perspective. And I also want to say that, for anybody that's a journalist doing this good work, to think about what you say. I mentioned some of the journalists that I listen to who, for the vast majority of the time I have a lot of respect. And but I see, especially for the journalists of color, the black journalists and other journalists who are non-white journalists, there are very few American Indian people in this space doing this kind of independent journalism. And it shows. Even with these journalists of color, it tends to be black centric. Like, they'll talk about, the rights of black people being violated, and American history, and how the modern policing system emerges out of slave patrols, and rightfully so. There is a legitimate connection to where we're at in our current historical moment that does come out of profound injustice to Black Americans in this history of slavery. But let's be clear, like, that's only one piece of that brutal American history that perpetrated profound injustices to certain populations of people. But it began with colonialism. It did not begin with slavery. It began with European invasion on these lands, and the violent taking of land from Native people, and the ensuing genocide that happened. But let's understand that Native people are still here. We survived genocide, not by much, but we are still here. There's reservation lands that are still under Native control and being protected by Native people. But journalists, do better. When you're talking about the injustices to community of color and racial profiling, all of that, when you're going to talk about these wrongdoings that come out of these egregious histories, think more broadly. Educate yourself about about the history of land theft and how we get to some of the places where we're at now. We have all been woefully miseducated in this country because Native people have been so systematically erased. At least for all the injustices that Black communities have been through, at least there's visibility. That's the same is not true for Native people. We have been systematically erased, and we have all been miseducated. So it's really on all of us to make sure that we understand the fullness of this American story and understand the U.S. as the product of these colonial uh, these colonial acts that come back to land theft and genocide. So, I'm an educator. This is how I think, and my work as an educator is to expand awareness and to teach students and to create curriculum, so that we can transcend this pattern of miseducation in our educational spaces. But you know, no offense to Black journalists or other journalists of color, but just be mindful that uh, that the injustices to people of color go beyond beyond skin color. It's about how entire nations of people were railroaded and undermined and eliminated in these various ways and made invisible. So just think about that in your reporting. Remember, we are all on the reservation now, and when I say that, it's that we are all at risk because Indians were the canary in the coal mine, and what they did to Indians, they are going to try to do to one extent or another to all other populations, because we are in fascist takeover of this country, and we can't pussyfoot around that. That's just the reality. Thanks for listening.